be most effective, the Social Host Ordinance should be tailored to a local community's day-to-day underage drinking problems. That leads to the first step: identify the local substance abuse problem in your community. Step 2, connect the problem with possible solutions. Step 3, identify existing relevant state and local laws. Step 4, what laws should be in place but are missing? Often, communities do not have to go out and develop a brand new ordinance. You may already have an ordinance on the books, such as a public nuisance law or a loud party ordinance, that can be expanded upon to include underage drinking in its definition. This could be an easy way to pass a social host type ordinance and to be able to combat the problem of underage drinking in your community. Another thing that's important to remember about social host ordinances is that it's already illegal for adults to furnish alcohol or provide alcohol to youth. What's different about a social host ordinance is that it also makes it criminal for adults to provide a location for underage drinking to occur. Once a social host ordinance is determined necessary in your community, these important steps are critical. First, get local stakeholders involved. Important key stakeholders include law enforcement, local government, judicial system, parents, and youth. Clearly, you want the partners that will be most affected by a social host ordinance to be involved in the development of an ordinance. This would include those that would be necessary for passage, such as members of your city council or county board of supervisors. Those individuals that will be enforcing the law. It's critical for those who will be processing or adjudicating social host ordinances, such as members of your judicial system, to be involved so that they understand the intent of the law. One of the most effective ways to pass a social host ordinance is to heavily involve your law enforcement officers. Often law enforcement officers feel that they arrive on the scene of an underage drinking party, yet don't have the authority to address the underage drinking unless they see a beer being handed to a youth.
And our past law was very comprehensive, but it was very difficult to maneuver for the officers. It required several steps and some notices and a lot of tracking down of information. And so our department just recently redid that ordinance, made it much easier and much more user-friendly for the officers to go in and take enforcement, be able to have a positive effect, shut these parties down, remove the alcohol, and make sure these people aren't continuing to have parties week after week or weekend after weekend.
Because we're talking about underage drinking, it's important that parents and youth have a voice in what a social host ordinance looks like. Second, know the community and the nature of the problem. Community coalitions can help mobilize the community by understanding the needs of the local scene.
The town of Miami has a social host ordinance, and we were very fortunate in that the mayor of that town was very receiving of what we had to say. He was excited. He started coming to the coalition meetings, and really, I believe within 2 meetings, we had enacted a social host in the town of Miami.
3, it may also help to reframe the underage drinking as a health risk. Health risks include brain development, youth mortality rates. Alcohol leads to increased risks of sexual assaults and other violent crimes.
In other words, we as adults need to ensure that young people cannot get their hands on alcohol. Again, if they can't obtain it, they can't consume it.
Alcohol poisoning actually can result in death and permanent damage to many other organs, including the brainstem, as well as brain injury.
Youth oftentimes don't protect themselves. They need us as adults to step in and ensure their safety. A social host ordinance will be the first step in that happening within our communities.
Once the social host ordinance is enacted, the next steps are educating the community, enforcing the law, adjudicating those who have committed the crime, and evaluating whether the ordinance is working as intended. Ways to educate the community include educational materials, flyers, and handouts, as well as local media advocacy.
What we've seen is sometimes with community readiness, there is disbelief, there is denial, not our children. Often what we also see is the low perception of harm around alcohol. It's not always considered a drug the way that some of the other drugs are. And sometimes we have to go back and realign how the community feels and look at that and attack that before we come back with a social host ordinance.
Establish data indicators before enacting to compare with post-enacting. It's important to establish a baseline to understand what was occurring in your community prior to a social host ordinance. It's also important to follow up and continue to collect data to understand how a social host ordinance can affect underage drinking in your community. A detailed guide about how to enact a social host ordinance in your community is available at www.drawyourline.com. And from the Governor's Office for Children, Youth, and Families, or by calling the PEMA Prevention Partnership at 520-624-5800. There are approximately 16 million alcoholics in the United States, and about a quarter of those are youth. It's easy for youth to get their hands on alcohol. As adults, let's take responsibility and do whatever we can to ensure that youth do not have easy access to alcohol.